Since we are a little bit behind the eight ball, we will now go to a talk by Gregg Maryniak, who is the Executive Vice President of the Space Studies Institute, which indeed is the source of a lot of the funding and innovation in work related to the work we just heard discussed, has been for quite some time. Gregg will give a talk that brings us from solar power satellites to non-terrestrial resources, relates them, puts them in perspective with each other and current activities. And I'm sure will lead to a lot of interesting questions and discussion. And for those of you who think the last talk was real interesting and find this talk real interesting, you should ask him about SSI activities tonight, where you can go and he can explain how people like you can help with these kind of things. Here's Gregg.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for the plug. Also, everyone is invited to come to the SSI Hospitality Suite this evening, and that will be in room 1442 after around 8 o'clock or so. How many of you heard this morning's panel discussion? Good, most of you. Okay, so you'll see a few things you saw before, but you'll see them again. I'm going to talk a little bit about the general subject of using non-terrestrial resources to provide clean power to the Earth. John's just given a very good summary of a lot of the details of the SPS system, so I may talk a little more about the details of building solar power satellites using material that's already in space. It's tough to believe in 20 years since, more than 20 years now since that picture was taken. That's Buzz Aldrin, and a little reflected image of the space plate is the only photograph of Neil Armstrong on the moon. It was taken with a camera because the camera was embedded in Neil's part of the spacesuit. So that's some space trivia for you. We believe, as a result of the lessons learned from Apollo, that it's possible to use the moon as a source of materials for providing clean power to the Earth. We're now caught on the horns of a sort of double dilemma. We need a lot more energy for our growing population. And in fact, as we strive on the Earth to recycle material resources and produce less pollution in the environment, we need even more energy per capita than we all currently use in industrial societies. At the same time, we've got a population problem, and the effects of using, and particularly of producing electrical power, are now known by us to be hazardous to the biosphere. In fact, potentially deadly to the biosphere. So what do? We need more energy, and this is a serious social, economic, and political problem. We've got a situation where most of the world's people are energy have-nots, and yet, unless we do something that drastic, the ways we obtain energy now, particularly fossil fuel burning, which is the energy production method of choice in the third world because it's the easiest thing to do. That's what we do historically in the West. Produces the very scary and very plausible scenario of global warming due to an enhancement of the greenhouse effect. Now, some people talk about it as if maybe it's really not real. There's virtually no doubt that CO2 buildup is taking place at an unprecedented rate. In fact, there's no debate about that. The question is, how much can the environment stand? One of the scarier theories of the greenhouse effect is that the Earth's biosphere is sort of a rubber band. It's very resilient up to a point. And when we reach that point, we'll start to see very dramatic changes. The third world nations, especially those in the lowland areas near the sea, are extremely concerned about this little joke. There is the true potential for entire nations like Bangladesh to be underwater if global warming takes place. And in fact, hard-headed people like the directors of the Shell Oil Corporation have just made a business decision in the last month or two to lengthen the legs on a North Sea oil rig that they're building. And it's going to cost them about $60 million to do this for this one particular rig in question that I heard about this decision. And that's real money. $60 million right now, they're spending it right now, because over the lifetime of this rig, they believe that it's entirely possible, in fact probably going to happen, that the ocean will rise, the North Sea will rise because of global warming.
How much higher?
Something like about 4 meters is what they're adding to their thing. Now, it's popular for people to talk about it, and certain people of note have said, what we really need to do is to conserve energy. And they're absolutely right. We do need to conserve energy. We're profligate in our energy use here and in all other developing countries, or developed countries as well. And we've all been guilty of not turning out the light now and then. But that's not nearly enough. It begins to help the problem, but it doesn't solve the problem in any meaningful way. Because, in fact, most of the world lives in energy poverty. There's a direct correlation between affluence and per capita energy consumption. And if the people of most of the world are to just feed their children, much less live in luxury, we have the very real threat of serious danger to our environment. And there's some deep social costs involved in energy poverty. For example, this picture is a reminder that in many parts of the third world, notably in Northern Africa, for example, women spend up to 75% of their time gathering fuel for cooking. That's energy slavery. But how do you get out of that if in fact, using more energy or creating more electrical power damages the environment? Well, one elegant solution, which all of you are probably aware of at this point in time, was proposed in 1968 by Dr. Peter Glaser. Glaser is a vice president of the Arthur D. Little Corporation, and he patented in that year the idea of placing large power collecting stations in space above the Earth's atmosphere in geostationary orbit, where the cells, solar cells, photovoltaics, as he proposed originally, would see sunlight virtually 24 hours a day and would transmit the electrical power so generated to the surface of the Earth in the form of a radio frequency beam. I was having a discussion with a couple of people in the hall before this, and they were saying, well, I've heard this rumor, this story, that there's some major basic technical glitch in transmitting microwave power from space. And in fact, that's not true at all. It's fairly highly developed technology to the point where the efficiency of electricity going into the transmitting antenna, in fact, the transmitting equipment of the SPS to power out into the grid on the ground is about 55%. And that's awfully good considering that the terrestrial long-range power transmission method with wires very seldom approaches 90%. A lot of heat losses and such in the cables. So considering you don't have to stretch an extension cord from GEO, it's a pretty good deal. And quietly, over the years, the technologies for receiving and converting this electricity have been refined to the point where the ground station is about 90% efficient. And there have been a lot of fairly dramatic experiments that most people have not seen, but in the early 60s, microwave-powered helicopters. A few years ago, the Canadians, using technology developed by Raytheon Corporation, flew a microwave-powered airplane, which they hope to use as a sort of a low-cost satellite equivalent, and just have an airplane at very high altitude perpetually to serve as both for weather station uses and for telecommunications activities. So it's been quite popular. Well, how come, another question that was asked of me is, why don't we hear about solar power satellites more? Why don't more people know about it as an energy option? And thereupon hangs the tail. That is, in the period from about 1977 to 1980, NASA and the Department of Energy were tasked by Congress to look at the idea of building solar power satellites. And they did so. In fact, they suggested that these would be a viable energy option and should be studied in quite a bit of detail. The National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences, which was tasked with overseeing the study, came back and said, no, let's not study it anymore right now. Let's kind of watch things for a while and do more research when appropriate. And there's probably several people at this conference who know the story about what happened at the time. The true story was that the fusion research community was very much afraid that this would cut into their action, and it's a very large action involving many thousands of people across the country. And basically it was decided a priority, before really studying it, to axe this option, to say let's not study it in any more detail. The reasons that were given were very interesting reasons. There were two reasons given in the National Research Council Oversight Study, basically. One was we can't make enough solar cells to do the job. That was probably baloney then. Usually I don't say baloney, but I'll say it today. The other reason, and certainly baloney now, the other reason though that was given was the launch costs that NASA was using in its estimates were too low. And that, I agree with the National Research Council, they were too low. In fact, the time was to build solar power satellites by launching all the component parts from the surface of the Earth using large, heavy-lift launch vehicles. That's a Boeing design for a single-stage orbit, reusable heavy-lift vehicle. And that could put 500 tons into low Earth orbit. Imagine 500 Volkswagen Beetles flying over our eye. This Boeing design could do it. Now here's the catch. Here's another picture of another 500 tons of low Earth orbit launch vehicle. And it tells you in a way that the numbers fail to convey that this is a huge undertaking, a tremendous system. You would have to launch one of these almost once a day for about a year to build a single SPS. And the system was completely reusable in its design. You don't even paint it between flights. You just basically plug in fuel to it and go. But even so, we all know the problems that you can't get replacement orbiters, much less getting a whole new line of supergiant space freighters. Well, does that mean we're out of the box? We can't build these useful solar power satellites in space, which could do a lot of good things, not only for the economy, but for the environment? Well, the answer, as most of you know, is we are not foreclosed from doing this because of the lack of super large heavy lift vehicles, if we change our way of thinking about space. If we realize that the Earth is not only not the best place in the solar system from which to mount space projects, but in fact it's the worst place in the inner solar system to do that. And the reason is that we sit at the bottom of the deepest gravity well in the inner solar system. It costs now, depending on whose accounting system you use, anywhere between $3,000 and $10,000 a pound to scale that gravity well, to climb out onto the plateau of free space. And at those prices, WAGs have said to us that if God would have intended human beings to fly in space, they would have given us much more money. But we don't have to live with the assumption that we have been living with, which is the Earth as the best place, because we can see just by looking at this model, ultimate model of the inner solar system, that we've got some places up near the top of the plateau of free space. And a prime candidate is the moon. It takes about 22 times less energy to throw something into escape from the moon than it does from the Earth. And to give you a feel for that, without throwing a number around, compare the size of a Titan rocket, which was necessary to place 2 astronauts in their suits into low Earth orbit, with the fact that it only took the top half of this little lunar module to put 2 astronauts and a rock into space on the moon. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the basic 22-to-1 ratio is just the basic ratio of the energies based on the different gravity of the 2 bodies. And if you add to that, you should add to that the fact that there's no atmosphere to impede launch from the moon, so it's actually a lot better in terms of time. The moon's got other nifty properties. It's so close that we can project our intelligence there. We can operate machinery there in real time from the ground, from the earth. That's called teleoperation. Big hot technology for use in underwater projects. The Titanic, for example, was explored with telerobotic equipment. This is a picture at SSI in Princeton of a visiting Japanese journalist from Asahi Shimbun, the largest newspaper in Japan, testing out, playing with our lunar teleoperations test experiment, where we've taken some very simple and cheap robots, in fact, the Radio Shack robots, and we have built a not so cheap but still modest time delay package, and it simulates the exact time delay between the Earth and the Moon. We load up all the delay on the signal side, the outbound side, and you watch from a TV camera. You can switch to several different views you can switch to. In fact, we just opened up an exhibit at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, which enables people to do this real cute exhibit. And you learn very quickly that it's so simple, even a CEO can do it. In fact, young children, the quickest to adapt. Yeah, it takes, well, see, but you're not a young child. We tested this with people from lots of different cultures. That's a picture from International Space University at MIT in Boston in '88. In fact, Dr. Cutler was president of that. And we learned that most people double their performance with this system in about 10 minutes of practice. And we had one guy who had wonderful performance from the start, not at ISU, but later. And I started asking him 25 questions, and I couldn't figure out why he was so good. He played the piano, he just picked it right up. Turned out he was a helicopter pilot. He just both hands at both feet. People can do this. It's not a problem at all. And the moon is made of good things for space construction of solar power satellites. In addition to the abundant oxygen, silicon, iron, aluminum, and lots of interesting herbs and spices in that 3%. So we've been looking at ways to mine lunar material. We've been actually demonstrating some of that. We're doing some of this now at University of Maryland. And a key tool is a way to get the lunar material into space without using chemical rocketry. And this device that's pictured here is called the mass driver. It's the tube you see going off to the horizon. It's an electromagnetic launcher. It's capable of letting go of its payloads with sufficient precision that with a little bit of trimming from downrange stations of the velocity, you can hit a target about the size of the wall behind me at L2 in the Earth-Moon system with these raw payloads. SSI has built 3 mass drivers. The first was built at MIT in 1976 and 77. That's Professor O'Neill in the turtleneck. And to our right of him is Professor Henry Cohn. Henry and Jerry, their grad students, built the first machine. There was a big engineering myth that if you tweaked and tuned maybe someday you could get 50 gravities acceleration on a machine like this. This first hunk of junk, built out of a couple $1,000 of scrap parts, got 33 Gs first try. And we've gone on to build mass drivers 2 and 3 at Princeton University under SSI auspices. And the acceleration has gone up to over 1,800 gravities. What that means is the length of a lunar machine goes down from 5 miles with a railroad spur on the moon to about 500 feet. And in fact, some new developments that are going on at Sandia Labs, with whom we're in correspondence, on their coil gun, which is basically a mass driver with a non-powered bucket, indicate that you can do probably even better than this. But once you have the lunar materials on the plateau of free space where they're relatively inexpensive, they're still raw materials, and you need to process them into feedstocks for building solar power satellites or what have you. And there are a lot of different ways to do that, although we didn't always know that that was the case. We hoped there might be one way. And SSI undertook some research with Dr. Bob Waldron, who's in the session 2 doors down from Rockwell International. And under SSI contract, he tested out all the unknown reaction rates and such having to do with the hydrofluoric acid leaching process, which gets you all the pieces of the chemical pie. But it's a very complicated process. This is a nice painting of what that process chemical plant might look like. What we're fond of saying at SSI that when people came to North America from Europe, they didn't bring building materials, they just brought their tools. But it was pointed out to us over time that the tools that they brought were not very complex tools like complete sawmills, forges. They brought axes and shovels first. So we've been looking now at simple techniques to get relatively simple products that could be immediately useful in SPS or other things like taking volatilizer out of the soil, like how to separate the good stuff from the bad stuff, what mining engineers call beneficiation using electrostatic techniques, and using fairly simple physical processing techniques to make fused soil structures. Here's some work that's done on right in this neighborhood, really, with SSI supplied Fresnel lens. We've been making fused soil structures and bricks and paving materials. But the real product that's of tremendous interest to us, which you'll hear more about in just a few minutes, is the idea of using glass derived from lunar soil and making composite materials, that is, two-part materials with fiber and a matrix, where both the fiber and the matrix are derived from lunar glass. And Brent Goldsworthy Engineering is with us today. We'll be talking about that in a few minutes, so I will pass over that. This is his energetic co-conspirator, Charlie Coggins, dipping some glass materials, and I'll let Brent explain what this stuff is. This is a solar concentrator at McDonnell Douglas that Brent and SSI and McDonnell Douglas are using to make the first pilot-scale lunar processing plant. And the output of these sorts of things will be light, strong materials. This is a terrestrial composite developed by Goldsworthy for SPS studies in the late 1970s. Light and strong. I'll tell you more about that. His machines to automatically fabricate this kind of beam material will be ideal for building solar power satellites in space. Now, SSI looked originally at the design of an SPS that could be built from lunar material. And it should be noted that there were two previous studies on SPSs from lunar materials that were done in the 1977 through 80 timeframe. One was done by Ed Bach in Journal Dynamics. The other was done by MIT. And the results were that between 90 to about 95% of an SPS mass appeared to be available from lunar material. But what they were doing in those studies was taking the Earth-launched design, what's called the Boeing baseline design, and saying, what can we substitute with this design from the moon to make it from lunar material? And we decided to take a look at it and say, let's design it from scratch to be lunar, to optimize on using lunar materials. And the answer came out very interesting. It looks like less than 1% of the mass of an SPS needs to come from the Earth. The rest will come from the moon. And what that does to the cost of building a solar power satellite is reduce it by about 97%. So it's a whole different ballgame for SPS if you use non-terrestrial materials. Now, at the time we did the first SPS from lunar materials design work in the mid-1980s, we said any lunar material was fair game. Anything that's available in abundance on the moon, you can use. But since then, we've been thinking about the process and with the benefit of thoughts from Greg Goldsworthy and Cutler and others, we've come to realize that different lunar materials, that not all lunar materials are as easily usable as others. So we have now undertaken a new study to look at what sort of SPS designs you can build from only simple, really crude non-terrestrial resources, including material from shuttle external tanks, iron, oxygen, and glass from the moon. Now, we're not the only country, that is, the U.S. is not the only country involved in SPS work. The Soviets have shown considerable interest in it, and in fact, within the last month or so, we started to receive some letters from the Soviets that are really opening up, and they started to ask some very technical, detailed questions that show that they really are interested in it. We've never been completely sure of the depth of their interest. This shows a design that was pictured in the Times of London. It's a cartoon of a cartoon, but it's a very clever design. It's very similar to one of the designs that our own study came up with. It uses a trough concentrator to concentrate a band of sunlight on a line source of gallium arsenide cells. A major difference between the Soviet system and the U.S. systems that have been looked at so far has been the Soviet system uses laser frequency light to transmit the energy to the ground. It's a very clever design, and is one that if you're not interested in optimizing on use of lunar materials, it would be very rational. In fact, some of our own ideas are that you might just bring up the line source of cells and get the rest of it all from the moon, for example, and that makes a lot of sense. I showed this slide this morning. The Europeans have started some serious studies just in the last year or so on satellite solar power. They've been interested in it for a long time. They've looked at ways to do it. They've looked at sites for receiving the power, for example, in the North Sea. They are now actively engaged in studies and spending real honest to goodness Deutschmarks to learn a lot about this. And just last week there was a Eurospace convention specifically dedicated to solar power for space to ground and space to space use. In fact, around here someplace, right here, in fact, we have some brochures about the 1991 Paris conference on solar power satellites. And the French have been extremely interested with Électricité de France, the French national power utility, taking a lead role in that. One country that's doing more than just thinking about it is the Japanese. These are corporate brochures of Shimizu and Mitsubishi Electric corporations. Mitsubishi Electric is the General Electric or Westinghouse of Japan. They make a lot of the high power transmission equipment that's in use there. Shimizu is the second largest construction company in the world. Both of their brochures wax lyrical about solar power satellites. The Shimizu brochure shows this familiar picture of a lunar base. And if you look closely on the right-hand side, you can see a mass driver launching material for building solar power satellites from the moon. As I mentioned this morning to many of you, the Japanese are also engaged in a project to go further into depth in looking at the power transmission aspects of solar power satellites. ISIS, which is the academic group of the triad of Japanese space activity, has flown a series of sounding rocket experiments to test radio frequency propagation of electricity. And they're now prepared to fly this very large space free flyer unit, SFU, in a mode where it will send power to the ground and learn a lot more about propagation. I put this one in the room to remind me that there are other kinds of materials, like shuttle tanks that we might use to build some demonstration SPSs. So here's sort of the big picture. The idea is use material already in space, specifically from the moon, to get the feedstocks for building solar power satellites that could provide energy to the Earth. And this idea has been looked at by the government for the first time in 10 years in this study, the Lunar Energy Enterprise Case Study. And NASA has run out of copies of this particular study, but the Space Studies Institute decided that was a good situation, so we went out and got permission from a couple of copyright holders whose work is shown in this volume. And we are now reprinting it and basically selling it for cost. If you're interested in getting a copy, you can talk to the people at the SSI table on the second floor. And NASA was looking at three things, helium-3, and in Princeton we have a little joke, we've got a lot of fusion people, we say fusion is the power source of the future, and it always will be. And they kick us. And there was another system that was looked at, the idea of paving large sections of the moon with solar cells and beaming the power directly from the moon. But the moon's dark half the time, and it kind of alleviates a lot of benefits of doing the SPS in the first place. The one we like is the solar power satellite from non-terrestrial materials. Well, I want to finish by saying that if you're interested in this area and think it should be considered as an energy option, then for God's sakes, get up off your tails and do something about it. I've been coming to these conferences for a lot of years, and people say, oh yeah, this is neat, this is cool. But we need to get this idea out in the world of ideas. The way that happens is by people saying, hey, what about SPS? When you see some article about the the Audubon Society, for example, is now funding studies of light water nuclear reactors. Can you believe that? They are, because they know that fossil fuel pollution is going to kill their birds. And write a letter and say, hey, what about SPS? That should be your mission. We're doing that. This is a recent issue of Space News. Dr. Gerard O'Neill, our founder, I got an op-ed piece in there. I have a couple op-eds from the Washington Times and the Los Angeles Times, which I commend to you. I invite you to come and take a copy. We've got to get this idea out there. It's starting to get seen. In fact, the Vice President Quayle, in a speech a couple weeks ago, gave this great quote: "Material from the moon could enable us to supply many of the Earth's energy needs safely and cleanly from space." And it's not a coincidence that he had dinner with O'Neill a few weeks before he said that. There was one happy thing, which I'm delighted to report, is that this month's issue, the June-July issue of Air and Space magazine, has a delightful article entitled 300 billion watts, 24 hours a day, which is one of the first large articles on SPS that has come about in a long time. And I'll upload that too. That's good, yeah. And in fact, it says, the famous legal scholar Debbie Reynolds once said, "She who don't toot with her own horn never get tooted." Actually, it was her mother who said that. So the only U.S. research aimed squarely at solar power satellites in the past decade has been sponsored by the Space Studies Institute. And then goes on to talk about our work on non-terrestrial materials for this. And I say this to let you know that if you are interested in this option, we also need your support. We need your help to do the kinds of research I've shown today, and to keep this idea afloat in the world of ideas and let it get a serious consideration. We need it. We need every watt, every erg, every joule we can get, whether it comes from fusion or photovoltaics on the ground or windmills. We need every bit of it. And we need to have SPS as part of our area of options. We also need to consider SPS as part of the Space Exploration Initiative. Congressman George Brown of California, said about a month ago to the IEEE, which is very interested in SPS, that's the Electronics Engineering Organization. He said that for some reason, the American aerospace community seems to think that the only two places in space you can go to are the moon and the Mars. And he can't figure out why that's so. He has proposed sort of the Earth metropolitan area that is using lunar resources to build SPSs to save the Earth. Another thing I want to ask you to do, if you're interested in space power, is to subscribe to the journal that's edited by Dr. Andy Cutler called Space Power. And not surprisingly, there are flyers up here that can tell you how to do that. It's an excellent journal, and we very much need to see it in every business, every technical business, every library that we can get it into, every university that we can get it into. And that's an action you can take that can help to greatly expand the circle of people who know about this. So with that, I will conclude and say, please come up and get some of this information. I hope to see you during the course of the conference, particularly tonight at the SSI Hospitality Suite. And spread the word that it is possible to get clean power from space to save the Earth, our favorite planet after all. Thank you.